Nuclear War. Chapter 1. The Ashes of Yesterday. You will hear in this video. In the wake of Russia's sudden nuclear strike, the man emerges from the safety of a deep mine, only to find his world reduced to smoldering ruins. Desperation drives him to search for his family, but his journey is fraught with horror as he navigates a landscape twisted by the bombs. The air crackles with radiation, and the once familiar streets are filled with shadows that move unnaturally, remnants of people who were caught in the blasts. When he finally reaches his home, he is confronted with the horrifying sight of his family's remains, nothing but ashes and bones. Overwhelmed by grief and guilt, he vows to survive in their memory, even as his sanity begins to fray. Part 1. The Escalation. I was never one for politics, never cared much for the world beyond the confines of my life and work. My days were simple, spent deep in the belly of the earth, where the air was thick with dust, and the only sounds were the rhythmic clink of pickaxes and the occasional grumble of shifting stone. It was monotonous, sure, but it was safe. Down there, in the bowels of the earth, the world above seemed like a distant dream, or maybe a nightmare. The news of the escalating tensions between Russia and the United States trickled down to U.S. miners like a distant echo, distorted by layers of rock and dirt. The radio we kept in the break room, a relic from the days when men still believed in hope, crackled with static-filled reports of military maneuvers and diplomatic spats. Some of the guys would gather around, their faces grim and lined with worry, but I paid it little mind. Wars were things that happened in far-off lands, to other people. Not here. Not to us. But that day the air felt different. There was a tension, a palpable weight pressing down on us, as if the earth itself knew something we didn't. I remember glancing up at the narrow shaft of light that filtered down from the surface, a single thread connecting us to the world above. It seemed dimmer, somehow, as though the sun had grown tired of shining on a world that was tearing itself apart. During our lunch break, I heard it again. That voice on the radio, strained with the urgency of someone who knows they're delivering bad news. Russian forces have mobilized. Potential for nuclear conflict. Highest alert since the Cold War? The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and ominous. I tried to shake off the unease that crept up my spine, telling myself it was just another empty threat, another round of saber-rattling from men in suits who didn't know the first thing about the real world. But then, the ground beneath my feet trembled, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The guys around me froze, their eyes wide with the same question that burned in my mind. What the hell was that? For a moment the mine was silent, the kind of silence that comes when the world is holding its breath. Then, like the first crack in a dam, the rumble grew into a roar, shaking the walls and sending a shower of dust down from the ceiling. We bolted for the lift, our hearts pounding in our chests, the sound of the earth groaning and shifting all around us. It felt like the mine was alive, like it was trying to swallow us whole. The lift creaked and groaned as it carried us up, every second feeling like an eternity. When we finally reached the surface, I was struck by a strange sense of unreality, as if I'd stepped into a world that wasn't mine. The sky. God, the sky. It was black, but not the kind of black that comes with nightfall. This was a sickly, roiling mass of clouds, choked with ash and smoke. The sun was a dim, angry red, casting an eerie, hellish glow over the landscape. I could see the city in the distance, or what was left of it. The buildings were dark silhouettes against the blood-red sky. And where there should have been movement, cars, people, life, there was nothing. Just stillness, like the world had been paused, waiting for someone to press play again. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the sight of the city or the sky. It was the silence. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of traffic. Just the heavy, oppressive silence of a world that had just died and didn't even know it yet. We stood there, a group of men who spent their lives working with their hands, men who thought they knew what it meant to be strong. But in that moment, we were just scared animals, looking up at the sky and realizing that we were nothing. just specks of dust in a universe that had just decided it was time to clean house. The radio, still clutched in someone's trembling hand, crackled to life again. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The voice was different now, panicked and raw. "Russia has launched a full-scale nuclear attack. Impact in minutes. Take cover. God help us all." My first thought was of my family, my wife, Emma, and our 2 kids, Jake and Sophie. They were at home, probably sitting in the living room, watching TV, unaware that their world was about to end. I needed to get to them. I needed to protect them. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. The missiles were already on their way, and there was no place on Earth that was safe anymore. The others started to scatter, running in different directions, as if there was anywhere they could go that would make a difference. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. The radio fell silent again, leaving us alone with the knowledge that we were living on borrowed time. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A flash of light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, brighter than the sun itself. It was followed by another and another, until the entire horizon was lit up with the fury of 1,000 suns. The ground shook again, harder this time, and I knew. This was it. This was the end. The sky erupted in flames, and I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to get away, to find some kind of shelter. But no matter how fast I ran, I knew there was no escaping what was coming. The world was burning, and I was just a man, running from the fire. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like the drums of war. Part 2. The First Strike. When I woke, the world was a different place. I was lying on my back, half buried in dirt and debris, the taste of blood and ash thick in my mouth. My head throbbed, each pulse sending a fresh wave of pain through my skull. But it was nothing compared to the searing agony that tore through my chest with every breath. For a moment, I thought I was dead, that maybe this was hell, and that I was destined to lie here, broken and alone, for eternity. But hell, I realized, was above me, not below. With a groan, I forced myself to sit up, wincing as I dislodged a chunk of concrete that had been pressing against my ribs. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The mine entrance was gone, buried beneath a mountain of rubble. The ground itself was torn apart, jagged fissures running through the earth like veins of some diseased monster. The air was thick with dust and smoke, turning every breath into a struggle, every gasp a battle. But it was the silence that unnerved me the most. That same awful, suffocating silence I'd felt when I first came to the surface. Except now, it was different. It was the silence of absence, the silence of a world that had lost its voice. I staggered to my feet, legs shaking beneath me, and forced myself to move. I had to get to my family. I had to know if they were alive. As I stumbled through the ruins of the world I once knew, the sky burned above me, a sickly orange glow that seemed to stretch on forever. The city, what was left of it, was just a dark smudge on the horizon. The buildings that hadn't been leveled were little more than hollow shells, their windows shattered, their walls cracked and crumbling. Cars were twisted wrecks. Some flipped onto their roofs, others fused to the ground by the heat of the blast. I passed a playground, or at least, what used to be one. The swings were still there, but the metal was warped and blackened, the chains twisted into grotesque shapes. The slide had collapsed into a heap of melted plastic and steel, and the sandbox was now just a pit of ash. I stopped for a moment, staring at it, trying to reconcile the image of the playground with the memories of my own kids laughing and playing, their voices filled with the kind of joy that only children seem to know. But the laughter was gone, replaced by that damnable silence, and I had to keep moving. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of my neighborhood that I began to feel it. That gnawing, creeping dread that starts in the pit of your stomach and works its way up, choking the breath out of you. The houses were gone, flattened or burned to the ground. The streets were littered with debris, bricks, broken glass, and things I didn't want to think about. And the smell, God, the smell, burning flesh, scorched earth, and something else, something acrid and metallic that burned my nose and throat. I called out their names, first quietly, then louder, my voice hoarse and cracking, but there was no answer. There was no one left to answer. The thought hit me like a sledgehammer, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the ground, my hands digging into the dirt as if I could somehow find them buried beneath the rubble. I didn't cry, not yet. The shock was too great, the horror too overwhelming to process. And then I saw it. What was left of my house, or rather, the place where my house used to be. The walls had been blown apart. The roof collapsed in on itself. The front porch, where Emma used to sit with a cup of tea while the kids played in the yard, was just a pile of broken wood and shattered glass. The garden she'd worked so hard on was nothing more than a blackened patch of earth, the flowers and plants reduced to ash. I could still see the remnants of the swing set, one of the seats dangling precariously from a half-melted chain. With a numb sense of detachment, I walked toward the wreckage, my feet dragging in the dirt. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was walking through a nightmare, like any second I'd wake up and everything would be normal again. But this was no dream. This was real. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a hammer against my ribs. I called out again, but the only answer was the distant echo of my own voice, carried away on the toxic wind. I dropped to my knees and began to dig, frantically clawing at the debris, ignoring the pain as splinters of wood and shards of glass sliced into my hands. I had to find them. I had to know. And then, under a section of the collapsed roof, I saw something that stopped me cold. A small, charred object, half buried in the rubble. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. It was a doll, or what was left of one. The once bright fabric was singed and blackened, the face barely recognizable. But I knew it. I knew it because it was Sophie's favorite, the one she'd carried with her everywhere since she was a baby. That was when the tears came. I collapsed onto the ground, clutching the doll to my chest, my body racked with sobs. The grief, the horror of it all washed over me in a wave so powerful that I thought it would drown me. I wanted to scream, to tear at the sky, to curse whatever gods had allowed this to happen. But all I could do was cry, the sound of my own despair swallowed by the silence of a world that had ended. Hours passed. Or maybe it was days. I don't know. Time had lost all meaning in this place. Eventually, the tears ran dry, leaving me hollow, empty. I knew deep down that they were gone, that Emma, Jake, and Sophie had been taken from me in an instant, burned away by the fire that had consumed the world. But knowing didn't make it any easier. It didn't make the pain any less real. When I finally found the strength to stand, the doll still clutched in my hand, I knew that I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let this be the end. Not for them. Not for me. I had to keep moving. Had to find some way to survive. Even if I didn't know why. Even if the world was nothing more than a wasteland of ash and bones. I turned away from the ruins of my home, the last remnants of my life crumbling to dust behind me, and started walking. The city loomed in the distance, a dark, silent monolith against the blood-red sky. There was nothing left for me here, nothing but memories that would tear me apart if I stayed. So I walked, one foot in front of the other, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to go somewhere. The world had ended, but I was still here, and as long as I was, I had to keep moving, even if there was nothing left to move toward. Part 3. The Descent. The city loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the sickly orange sky. Each step I took toward it felt heavier than the last, as if the very air was thickening around me, pulling me down. The roads were eerily empty, littered with the detritus of a world that no longer existed, shattered glass, twisted metal, and the occasional charred remnant of a life that had once been. But it wasn't just the physical weight that bore down on me. It was the crushing realization that this desolate, silent ruin was all that remained of civilization. The city that had once been alive with the hum of human activity was now a tomb, its skyscrapers like tombstones, towering over a graveyard of forgotten lives. The streets, once filled with the noise of traffic and the bustle of people, were now unnervingly quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of debris underfoot and the occasional groan of a building struggling to remain upright. I found myself moving faster, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the horizon for any sign of life, any hint that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. But there was nothing. No voices, no movement. Just the oppressive stillness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The city was dead, and I was its only witness. As I ventured deeper into the urban wasteland, the true extent of the devastation became apparent. The buildings closest to the impact zone had been leveled, reduced to piles of rubble that stretched for blocks. Those that still stood were scarred and blackened, their windows blown out, their walls cracked and buckled from the force of the blast. Here and there, fires still smoldered, sending tendrils of smoke into the sky, as if the city itself was exhaling its final breath. It wasn't until I reached the heart of downtown that I noticed the first signs of what had once been human life. The remnants of bodies, twisted and burned, lay scattered among the wreckage. Some were little more than shadows, etched into walls by the searing heat of the explosion. Others were charred husks, barely recognizable as human. I tried not to look, tried to keep my focus on the road ahead, but the images seared themselves into my mind, each one a fresh wound that cut deeper than the last. I stumbled across an overturned car, its doors flung open, its interior scorched and blackened. Inside, I could just make out the remains of a family, a mother, a father, and a child, their faces frozen in a grotesque rictus of terror. I turned away, bile rising in my throat, but the sight stayed with me, a vivid reminder of the horror that had swept across the world in the blink of an eye. The deeper I ventured, the more the city began to resemble a labyrinth of decay, each turn leading me further into a maze of destruction. The roads were barely passable, choked with debris and the twisted remains of vehicles. Buildings leaned precariously, their facades crumbling, threatening to collapse at any moment. I knew I had to keep moving, had to find shelter before night fell. But the city seemed intent on swallowing me whole, trapping me within its ruins. And then, in the distance, I heard it, a low, droning hum that cut through the silence like a knife. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, a product of my frayed nerves and exhausted mind. But as I drew closer, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere up ahead, just beyond the next block. My pulse quickened, a spark of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Maybe there were others who had survived, others who could help me find some semblance of safety in this shattered world. But as I rounded the corner, my hope was quickly extinguished. The source of the noise wasn't human at all. It was a drone, hovering ominously in the air above a crumbling office building. Its sleek, metallic body glinted in the dim light, its sensors sweeping the ground below with an unsettling precision. I froze, my instinct screaming at me to hide, to get out of sight before it noticed me. But it was too late. The drone's camera swiveled in my direction, locking onto me with a cold, mechanical gaze. Panic surged through me as I ducked behind a half-collapsed wall, my heart pounding in my ears. I'd heard rumors about these drones before the war. Automated sentinels, programmed to seek out survivors and eliminate them. Whether they were Russian or American, I didn't know, and I wasn't about to find out. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, had to lose it before it could alert whoever or whatever controlled it. I crouched low, moving as quietly as I could through the rubble, trying to stay out of sight. The drone continued to hover above the building, its sensors scanning the area with an unnerving patience. I could feel its gaze sweeping over the landscape, searching, hunting. The thought of being caught, of being dragged back to some facility, or worse, filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd felt before. I crept through the ruins, keeping to the shadows, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, every crunch of gravel underfoot a potential betrayal. My mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the city, trying to find a route that would lead me to safety. But the streets were a twisted, unfamiliar maze, and with each step, I felt the drone's presence pressing down on me, Closer, closer. And then, just as I thought I might have lost it, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. A mechanical whir, followed by the unmistakable click of a weapon being armed. The drone had found me. Without thinking, I bolted, sprinting down the nearest alley, my legs pumping furiously as I dodged debris and obstacles. The drone's hum rose to a menacing pitch, and I could hear the whine of its engines as it gave chase. A burst of gunfire tore through the air behind me, bullets ricocheting off the walls, sending showers of sparks in every direction. I ran harder, pushing my body to its limits, the terror of what was behind me driving me forward. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop, couldn't afford to slow down. The alley twisted and turned, narrowing in places, forcing me to duck and weave, but still the drone followed, relentless, unyielding. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it. A narrow gap between two buildings, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Without hesitation, I dove for it, scraping my arms and legs against the rough concrete as I forced my way through. The drone's engines roared behind me, but it was too large to follow. I could hear it hovering just beyond the gap, frustrated, angry. I emerged on the other side, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The drone was still there, hovering above the alley, its sensors sweeping the ground for any sign of me. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay as still as possible, willing it to leave. Minutes passed, agonizing, endless minutes, before the drone finally moved on, its engines fading into the distance. I collapsed against the wall, my legs giving out beneath me, the adrenaline leaving my body in a rush. I was safe, for now. But the encounter had left me shaken, a stark reminder that the dangers of this new world were not just the visible, physical ones. There were threats in the shadows, unseen, unfeeling, and they were just as deadly. As I lay there trying to gather the strength to move, I realized that the city was not just a graveyard. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. I needed to find shelter, someplace safe where I could rest and gather my thoughts. But more than that, I needed to find others, survivors like me, who might know more about what had happened, who might have a plan, a way out of this nightmare. The drone had shown me that I couldn't survive alone, not for long. The city was a labyrinth of death, and if I was going to make it through, I needed allies, people who could watch my back, who could help me navigate the dangers that lurked around every corner. With a groan, I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle protesting the effort. The city stretched out before me, a maze of ruins and ash, but somewhere within it, I knew there had to be others. People like me, clinging to life in the wreckage of a world that no longer made sense. I would find them. I had to. Because alone, I wouldn't survive. And as I took my first step back into the desolate streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The city had claimed countless lives already. I couldn't let it take mine too. Part 4. The Silent Streets. The sky above was an oppressive gray, choked with smoke and ash that blotted out the sun. The remnants of daylight that filtered through the thick clouds did little to dispel the gloom that had settled over the city. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of metal and the distant groan of collapsing buildings. It felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. I moved cautiously through the streets, my senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, almost unnatural. It was as if the city was a hollow shell, stripped of all life and sound. The occasional gust of wind would stir up clouds of dust, sending them swirling through the streets like phantom shadows. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the stillness, a constant reminder of how alone I was. As I walked, I passed the remnants of what used to be shops and homes. The storefronts were shattered, their displays reduced to fragments of glass and twisted metal. The smell of burnt wood and melted plastic filled the air, a constant reminder of the inferno that had ravaged the city. I could see signs of the suddenness of the destruction. Tables set for meals, cars parked in driveways, all frozen in time by the blast. It was as if the city had been abruptly paused, leaving behind only the broken pieces of a life that had once been vibrant. At one point, I stumbled across a playground. The swings, once filled with laughter, now hung lifelessly, their chains twisted and bent. The slide, once a source of joy, was now a molten mess of metal and plastic. I paused for a moment, staring at the remnants of what had been a place of innocence and joy. The contrast between the playground's past and its current state was a painful reminder of what had been lost. As I continued through the city, I began to notice the absence of birds and other wildlife. There were no sounds of insects, no distant chirping or rustling. The only creatures that seemed to have survived the devastation were scavengers, rats and stray dogs, their eyes glinting with an unsettling intelligence as they foraged among the ruins. Their presence was both reassuring and disturbing. They were survivors of a sort, but their existence in this new world was a stark reminder of how nature had adapted to the aftermath of humanity's destruction. My search for shelter led me to what appeared to be an old library, its facade cracked but still standing. The heavy doors were ajar, creaking softly as they swayed in the wind. I hesitated for a moment before pushing them open, the groan of the hinges echoing through the empty space. Inside, the library was a jumble of overturned bookshelves and scattered volumes. The smell of mildew and decay was strong, mingling with the acrid odor of smoke that had seeped in from outside. I made my way through the darkened aisles, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The library had once been a place of knowledge and refuge, but now it was a labyrinth of destruction, its once pristine pages now singed and torn. As I walked, I could hear the faint scuttling of rats in the dark corners, their presence a constant reminder of the world's new order. In the back of the library, I found a small storage room. It was relatively intact, the shelves filled with dusty supplies and forgotten remnants of a time before. I searched through the supplies, finding a few cans of food and some bottled water. The food was stale, the water slightly tainted, but it was better than nothing. I gathered what I could carry and settled into a corner of the room, trying to make myself as comfortable as possible. The silence of the library was different from the silence outside. It was more profound, more oppressive. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of their history. The absence of human presence was palpable, a void that seemed to stretch out endlessly. As night began to fall, the library grew darker, the shadows deepening as the last remnants of daylight faded. I tried to rest, but the quiet was unsettling, the darkness closing in around me. I could hear the distant howls of scavengers and the occasional thud of collapsing debris, but it was the silence between these sounds that was the most disturbing. It was as if the world was waiting, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my dreams plagued by visions of the city burning, of my family lost in the flames. I would wake with a start, my heart racing, only to find myself alone in the darkened library, the silence once again settling over me. It was a lonely, empty kind of silence, one that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, threatening to pull me under. By morning, I felt as though I hadn't slept at all. The library, with its dust and decay, had become a tomb, a place where time had stopped and the past had been frozen in place. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The city was still out there, a vast, empty expanse of devastation, and I had to keep moving. I needed to find other survivors, find some way to make sense of this new world. As I gathered my supplies and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the shadows in the library were hiding something just out of sight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing, only the empty aisles and the distant echoes of a world that had ended. I stepped out into the light of the new day, the library's door creaking shut behind me. The city was still silent, still empty, but now I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I had to find answers, had to find other survivors. I had to keep moving. The city stretched out before me, a vast, desolate expanse. I could feel the weight of its silence pressing down on me, but I forced myself to push forward. I had to keep searching, had to keep fighting. The world had changed, but I had to change with it. I had to survive, and as I walked through the silent streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the darkness, waiting for its chance to strike. The city was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, and I was just another lost soul wandering its empty corridors. Part 5. The Ashes of Hope. The air was heavy with a lingering haze as I trudged through the remnants of what used to be my neighborhood. The streets were eerily deserted, with not a single soul in sight. Every step I took stirred up clouds of fine ash that had settled over everything like a shroud. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant sound of shifting debris or the mournful cry of a scavenger. I approached what remained of my street, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. I hoped against hope that some part of my old life might still be intact, that perhaps some trace of my family's existence might remain amidst the destruction. But as I drew closer, my heart sank further. The homes that lined the street were unrecognizable. What had once been vibrant, welcoming houses were now skeletal frames, their walls crumbling and their roofs sagging under the weight of debris. The once familiar landscape was now a grim tableau of destruction. I stumbled through the wreckage, pushing aside broken furniture and twisted metal, each movement revealing the magnitude of the devastation. I reached the remains of my own home, or what was left of it. The house had been reduced to a pile of rubble, its foundations shattered and its walls crumpled like paper. The garden, once a place of laughter and joy, was now a wasteland of scorched earth and twisted plant remains. I dug through the debris with desperate, frantic movements, hoping to find something, anything, that would offer a glimmer of hope. But all I found was a jumble of broken memories, a shattered picture frame, a half-burned book, the remnants of a child's toy, melted beyond recognition. My search became increasingly frantic as I sifted through the ashes. I called out for my family, my voice echoing hollowly through the ruins, but there was no response. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burnt wood and scorched metal, a constant reminder of the inferno that had consumed everything. My hope dwindled with each passing moment, replaced by an overwhelming sense of despair. As I stood amidst the ashes, the full weight of my loss hit me like a physical blow. I sank to my knees, the tears I had been holding back finally breaking free. The ground beneath me was hot and gritty, a harsh contrast to the cool, comforting earth that had once been my home. I felt utterly alone, a solitary figure in a world that had been turned into a charred wasteland. It was then that I noticed something glinting among the debris. I crawled toward it, pushing aside bits of rubble and twisted metal until I reached a small metal box. It was barely recognizable, its surface scorched and dented, but it was still intact. With trembling hands, I pried it open, hoping to find something that might bring me a sliver of solace. Inside, I found a few small personal items: a locket with a picture of my wife and children, a small, worn-out teddy bear that had belonged to my son, and a few other mementos of happier times. Seeing these objects, so deeply personal and filled with memories, brought a new wave of grief crashing over me. These were the last tangible connections I had to my family, and now they were all that remained, all that. I clutched the locket tightly, its weight a small comfort in the midst of my overwhelming loss. The realization that this was all I had left made the world seem even more hollow. The ashes of hope lay scattered around me, mingling with the debris of a life that had been abruptly and violently torn away. As I sat there, the silence around me felt even more profound, as if the city itself was mourning the loss of what had once been. The weight of the destruction was a palpable force, pressing down on me and threatening to crush my spirit. I could feel the oppressive presence of the empty city, a vast expanse of broken dreams and shattered lives. Nightfall brought with it an eerie stillness. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the once unchanging darkness of the city now seemed alive with unseen dangers. I needed to find shelter before it grew too dark, but the thought of navigating through the city's ruins, with its haunting silence and the lurking terror of the unknown, was almost too much to bear. With great effort, I forced myself to my feet, clutching the small box of mementos tightly. My hope, though fragile, still clung to the possibility of finding other survivors, of discovering some reason to continue in this nightmarish world. I moved through the desolate streets with a renewed sense of purpose, my grief fueling a desperate drive to find something, anything, that might help me make sense of the destruction around me. The city remained a ghostly labyrinth, its darkened streets stretching out endlessly before me. Each corner held the potential for new horrors, and each step I took felt like a step further into the abyss. But I couldn't stop now. I had to keep searching, had to find some sign of life, some way to keep moving forward. The ashes of hope lay heavy in my heart, but I knew that I had to carry on. The city was a place of nightmares, a realm of loss and despair, but I had to find a way to survive, to keep going despite the overwhelming sense of futility. I would not let the city claim me as its next victim. I had to find a way out. I had to find others. I had to survive. Part 6. The Remains. The city's desolation weighed heavily on me as I continued my search, my footsteps muffled by the layer of ash that coated the ground. The silence was unnerving, the air thick with the scent of charred remnants and decay. Every so often the wind would pick up, sending ash swirling around me like ghostly specters. The eeriness of the deserted streets was palpable, each shadow hiding secrets of the world that had once been. As I navigated through the ruins, I stumbled upon a large structure that had miraculously remained mostly intact amidst the chaos. It was the old community center, a place that had once been bustling with activity, but was now eerily silent. The front doors were ajar, creaking softly as they swung with the wind. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed them open, stepping into the darkness of the building. Inside, the community center was a maze of debris and broken furniture. The once vibrant murals on the walls were now faded and smeared with soot. The large hall, which had once hosted countless gatherings, was now a cavernous void, filled with the hollow echoes of my footsteps. The air was stale, tinged with the lingering odor of smoke and dampness. As I ventured deeper into the building, I found the remnants of what had been a shelter for many. Cots were overturned, their blankets torn and scattered. The sight was a stark reminder of the frantic attempts of others to find safety before the world had crumbled around them. I could almost hear the echoes of their hurried movements, the whispers of desperation that had filled these rooms in the moments before the end. In one of the side rooms, I discovered a stash of emergency supplies, canned goods, water bottles, and first aid kits. I rifled through the stockpile, grabbing what I could carry. Among the supplies, I found a notebook, its pages singed but still readable. It was filled with frantic scrawls and hastily written messages, a testament to the fear and confusion that had gripped the people who had sought refuge here. The notebook detailed the final days of the community center's occupants, how they had attempted to ration supplies, how they had made futile attempts to contact loved ones, and how their hope had gradually dwindled as the situation grew increasingly dire. The last entries were particularly haunting, filled with despairing pleas for help and a sense of resignation to their fate. Reading through these pages, I felt a deep, unsettling connection to those who had written them, as if their fears and sorrows had somehow become my own. The community center offered little solace, and I knew I couldn't stay there for long. As nightfall approached, the darkness seemed to close in around me with a palpable intensity. The shadows in the building grew longer, more menacing, and the silence became even more pronounced. I could feel the weight of the building's history pressing down on me, the echoes of lost voices mingling with my own growing sense of dread. I decided to move on, my supplies gathered, and my resolve hardened. As I left the community center and stepped back into the street, the night had fully descended. The city was bathed in an eerie, unnatural darkness, broken only by the faint, flickering light of a distant fire. The once familiar streets were now a labyrinth of shadows, the desolation more profound than ever before. I had hoped to find some sign of life, some indication that I was not alone in this nightmare. But as I wandered through the city, my hope began to wane. The only sounds I heard were the occasional rustling of debris and the distant, mournful howls of scavengers. The emptiness of the city was a physical presence, pressing in on me and making me feel increasingly isolated. As I walked, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, an odd, almost imperceptible movement in the darkness. I stopped, straining to see what it was, but the shadow quickly vanished, leaving me to question whether I had seen something real or if my mind was simply playing tricks on me. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, grew stronger. I pressed on, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. My mind was on edge, constantly alert to any sign of movement or sound. The city's silence seemed to mock my fear, amplifying the anxiety that gnawed at my insides. Each step I took felt like a step deeper into the unknown, each shadow a potential threat. The hours dragged on, and exhaustion began to take its toll. My muscles ached from the constant movement, and my mind felt like it was unraveling from the strain. I needed rest, but I knew I couldn't afford to let my guard down. The city was a place of danger and uncertainty, and I had to stay vigilant if I wanted to survive. Eventually, I found a small, partially intact building that seemed suitable for temporary shelter. It was a modest apartment complex, its exterior battered but still standing. I made my way inside, finding a small, relatively clean apartment on the ground floor. It offered a semblance of safety, at least for the moment. As I settled in for the night, the silence of the city pressed in on me from all sides. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and the shadows inside the apartment seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. I tried to rest, but sleep was elusive, plagued by visions of the city's destruction and the haunting memories of those I had lost. The weight of my grief and the terror of the world outside were heavy burdens, but I knew I had to keep moving, keep searching for answers. The city was a vast, empty wasteland, and I had to find a way to navigate its dangers and uncover whatever secrets it might hold. As I lay in the darkened apartment, my mind raced with questions and fears. The world had changed beyond recognition, and I was left to wander through its ruins, a solitary figure in a landscape of despair. But despite the overwhelming sense of loss and isolation, I knew I had to press on. There was still a chance, however slim, that I might find some fragment of hope amidst the ashes of the old world. Part 7. Grief and Madness. The apartment offered a fragile sanctuary. But as the night wore on, sleep eluded me. The darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the shadows within the room seemed to shift and writhe with an unsettling energy. My mind, already frayed from the loss and the horrors of the day, began to unravel further in the oppressive solitude. I lay on the floor, using a dusty old blanket as a makeshift bed, but the comfort it should have provided was absent. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, eerie howl of the wind through the cracked windows. Every creak and groan of the building seemed amplified, echoing through the empty rooms like the whispers of lost souls. The grief I had been holding at bay came crashing down in waves, each one more overwhelming than the last. Memories of my family flashed before my eyes, my wife's laughter, my children's innocent smiles. The weight of their absence was a physical pain, an ache that seemed to pierce my very soul. I clutched the small metal box of mementos tightly, its contents a bittersweet reminder of the life I had lost. As the night deepened, I began to hear faint, indistinct whispers. At first, I thought they were just the echoes of my own fractured mind, but they grew louder, more insistent. The whispers seemed to come from the walls, from the shadows, and from the very air around me. They called out to me in voices that I recognized as my family's, their tones laced with sorrow and desperation. I sat up abruptly, my heart racing as I looked around the darkened room. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they were no longer mere sounds but voices speaking directly to me. They were calling my name, pleading with me to join them, to come back to where they were. The intensity of their cries was almost unbearable, and I could feel my sanity slipping further away with each passing moment. Desperate to escape the torment of the voices, I stumbled out of the apartment and into the darkened hallway. The building's once familiar layout was now a labyrinth of shadows and distorted echoes. I wandered through the hallways, my footsteps echoing eerily off the walls, the whispers growing more frantic and accusing. As I made my way through the building, the whispers seemed to take on a physical presence. The shadows on the walls grew darker, more menacing, and the temperature dropped, making the air feel thick and suffocating. I could see shapes moving in the darkness, fleeting and indistinct, but each movement seemed to heighten the sense of dread that surrounded me. I found myself drawn to the building's basement, a place I had avoided earlier due to its dark and foreboding nature. But the whispers seemed to be guiding me there, urging me to follow. I hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, the darkness below seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. My rational mind told me to turn back, but the voices compelled me forward. With trembling hands, I descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing me with each step. The basement was a large, cavernous space, filled with old storage boxes and broken furniture. The air was thick with dust and the faint, musty odor of decay. I moved cautiously through the space, the whispers growing louder, their source elusive. In the center of the basement, I discovered a small makeshift shrine. It was an eerie sight. Candles burned in a circle, their flames flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. The floor around the shrine was covered in strange symbols, hastily drawn in what looked like ash or blood. The sight of the shrine filled me with a deep sense of foreboding. The whispers reached a crescendo as I approached the shrine, the voices now screaming in anguish. I felt a cold, icy hand grip my shoulder, and I spun around. But there was no one there. The sensation was so real, so tangible, that it left me gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I fell to my knees in front of the shrine, overwhelmed by a wave of despair. The voices seemed to be all around me, their pleas for release mingling with the oppressive darkness of the basement. The intensity of the experience left me feeling as though I was on the brink of madness, my grip on reality slipping further with each passing moment. In a moment of clarity, I realized that I needed to escape the basement, to get away from the voices that were driving me to the edge of insanity. I stumbled back up the stairs, the whispers fading as I left the basement behind. The building's darkness was less oppressive now, but the echoes of the voices lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the grief and madness that had taken hold of me. As I returned to the apartment, the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. I lay down on the floor again, but sleep was still elusive. The haunting whispers and the vision of the shrine were etched into my mind, a chilling reminder of the fragile line between reality and the unknown. I knew that I had to keep moving, to keep searching for some semblance of hope, but the horrors I had faced were a constant, gnawing presence. The city was a place of nightmares, a realm where the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed to blur. The grief and madness that had taken hold of me were only the beginning of the horrors I would face in this new, shattered world. I had to find a way to survive, to overcome the darkness that threatened to consume me. Part 8. The Haunted Night. The apartment offered scant comfort, but I had no choice but to spend the night there. The oppressive silence of the city outside seemed to press against the walls, making the darkness inside feel almost tangible. I lay on the floor trying to steady my breathing and quell the racing thoughts in my head. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to find solace, the night was far from peaceful. The darkness outside seemed to seep into the room, warping the shadows into menacing shapes that flickered and danced with a life of their own. The remnants of the day's turmoil mingled with my fears, creating a disorienting atmosphere. The silence of the city was occasionally broken by distant, eerie sounds, the creaking of a building settling, the faint rustle of something moving just beyond my sight. As I lay there, I could almost hear the soft, mournful cries of those who had perished in the disaster. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more insistent. I told myself it was my imagination, that the whispers from earlier were just a product of my fractured mind. But the cries grew too real, too vivid to ignore. The darkness was oppressive, closing in on me from all sides. I could feel an unseen presence in the room, a malevolent force that seemed to be watching me with an unblinking gaze. I tried to focus on the small metal box of mementos, hoping that the tangible reminder of my family might provide some comfort. Instead, it only seemed to intensify my sense of loss and isolation. I sat up abruptly, my heart racing as I heard a faint scraping sound from the other side of the room. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and revealing nothing out of the ordinary. The room was still, but the unsettling feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. My exhaustion was overwhelming, but sleep was a distant hope. Every noise, every shadow seemed to hold the potential for new horrors. The whispers from earlier had left me on edge, and every small sound seemed to amplify the fear that had taken root in my mind. The temperature in the room began to drop, the chill in the air seeping through the walls and into my bones. I wrapped myself tighter in the blanket, but it did little to stave off the creeping cold. The darkness outside pressed in, making the room feel like a coffin, the silence a suffocating shroud. As I tried to keep myself awake, I noticed a soft, flickering light coming from the window. I approached cautiously, peering through the cracked glass. In the distance, a fire burned, a small dancing light amidst the vast darkness. It was an eerie beacon in the desolate city, its flickering flames casting long, haunting shadows across the ruined landscape. I felt a strange compulsion to investigate, to follow the light and see if it led to any sign of life. The idea of finding other survivors, of connecting with someone, anyone, was a powerful draw, despite the risks. I grabbed a few essentials from the apartment and made my way toward the fire, the cold night air biting at my skin. Navigating through the wreckage of the city was disorienting. The once familiar streets were now a maze of debris and twisted metal. The firelight flickered in the distance, guiding me through the labyrinth of shadows. Each step I took felt like a step further into a nightmare, the darkness around me thickening with every passing moment. As I drew closer to the source of the fire, I noticed that the light was coming from an old warehouse. The building was partially collapsed, its exterior blackened by the fire that had consumed part of it. The flames were dying down, leaving only the embers glowing in the darkness. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the crackling of the dying fire. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of smoke and burnt wood. The interior was a wreck, with debris scattered everywhere. The fire had left behind a charred mess of old supplies and broken equipment. I searched the warehouse, calling out in vain for any sign of life. The silence was absolute, and the emptiness of the building was almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and the sense of being watched returned with a vengeance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I explored further, I found a strange sight. A makeshift altar in one corner of the warehouse, covered in old, tattered cloths and adorned with eerie symbols. The altar was surrounded by charred remnants of candles and strange objects that seemed out of place. The sight was both fascinating and terrifying, a grim reminder of the world's descent into chaos. The night wore on, and the sense of unease only grew stronger. I knew I couldn't stay in the warehouse for long. The darkness outside was pressing in, and the eerie silence of the building was almost too much to bear. I gathered what little I could find and prepared to leave, my mind still haunted by the whispers and shadows that had plagued me. As I stepped back into the night, the firelight behind me flickered one last time before fading completely. The darkness returned with a vengeance, the city's silence more profound than ever. I felt a profound sense of isolation and despair, knowing that the horrors I had faced were only a glimpse of what lay ahead. Part 9. Whispers in the Dark. The city, now a labyrinth of shadows and desolation, seemed to pulse with a malign energy as I ventured through it. The whispers that had plagued me earlier had become a constant presence, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, whispers that echoed off the walls, skittered through the ruins and seeped into my mind like a creeping poison. The eerie silence of the night was punctuated by these unsettling sounds, each whisper a chilling reminder of my isolation and the horrors that lay in wait. The air felt heavy, laden with an oppressive darkness that seemed to suffocate every thought and hope. I kept moving, driven by a mixture of fear and determination, my flashlight casting weak beams of light into the ever-present gloom. As I navigated through the streets, I noticed an increasing number of strange occurrences. Objects would move in my peripheral vision, only to be still when I turned to look directly. The shadows seemed to shift and change, forming grotesque shapes that danced and flickered as if mocking my every step. The darkness was alive, and it was as though the city itself was conspiring to drive me mad. I stumbled upon an old theater, its facade half collapsed and its marquee hanging askew. The building had been partially consumed by flames, but the remnants of its grandeur were still visible. A morbid curiosity drew me inside, and I pushed through the charred doors, stepping into the main auditorium. The interior was a grotesque parody of its former self. Dusty, broken seats, and torn curtains hanging like tattered shrouds. The theater was eerily silent, the only sound being the soft scuffle of my footsteps on the debris-strewn floor. As I explored the space, I found a small stage still intact, its velvet curtains singed, but not entirely destroyed. The stage seemed to beckon me, and I approached it with a mixture of apprehension and intrigue. The whispers were louder here, resonating through the empty seats in the darkened corners. Suddenly the lights flickered on the stage, casting a weak, flickering glow across the room. The light revealed an unsettling sight, a collection of old, faded playbills and posters, all depicting scenes of laughter and joy that felt grotesquely out of place in the current devastation. The contrast between the vibrant images and the surrounding decay was jarring, a stark reminder of what had been lost. As I examined the stage, a chilling sensation crawled up my spine. The whispers were now clear, forming words that I could almost understand. They spoke of betrayal, of broken promises, and of a world that had failed its people. The voices seemed to accuse me, their tones dripping with malice and sorrow. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, as if I had somehow contributed to the destruction around me. The sense of being watched grew stronger as I continued to explore the theater. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, and the temperature in the room dropped, making my breath fog in the cold air. The whispers became more insistent, their source elusive but their presence undeniable. The theater seemed to be a place of mourning, a sanctuary for the lost souls who had once found solace in its walls. I found myself drawn to a door at the back of the stage, partially hidden behind a fallen curtain. The whispers grew louder as I approached, urging me to open the door and uncover whatever lay beyond. With a sense of foreboding, I reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The room behind the door was a small, dusty storage space filled with old costumes and props. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. Among the clutter, I found an old wooden box covered in intricate carvings. The box was locked, but I could feel an inexplicable compulsion to open it. I fumbled with the latch, my hands trembling as I tried to force it open. Finally, with a creak, the box sprang open. Inside I found a collection of old theater masks, expressive faces frozen in exaggerated emotions of joy, sorrow, and rage. The masks were eerily lifelike, their eyes staring out with an unsettling intensity. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the masks seemed to be watching me, their painted expressions mocking my fear. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the masks were amplifying the voices. The room felt as though it was closing in on me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The sense of being surrounded by unseen eyes was overwhelming, and I could no longer distinguish between the whispers and the echoes of my own growing terror. In a panicked frenzy, I slammed the box shut and fled the theater, the whispers fading as I left the building behind. The night outside was colder and more desolate than ever, the cityscape stretching out before me like a vast, empty void. The experience in the theater had left me shaken, and I knew I needed to find a new place to rest, away from the malevolent presence that seemed to pervade the city. As I wandered through the darkened streets, the whispers continued to haunt me, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked in the shadows. The city was a place of nightmares, and I was a solitary figure lost in its heart of darkness. The voices of the past and the weight of my own grief seemed to converge, making each step a journey deeper into the abyss. Part 10. The First Decision. The city had become an inescapable labyrinth of despair, a grotesque testament to the devastation wrought by the nuclear fire. The whispers, Now an almost tangible presence accompanied me as I navigated through the empty streets. My every step felt heavy, laden with the weight of my grief and the horrors I had witnessed. I wandered aimlessly, searching for some form of shelter or sign of life, but the city remained a silent, unyielding wasteland. The oppressive darkness seemed to press against me from all sides, the weight of the silence broken only by the occasional echo of my own footsteps. The ghosts of the past, the voices of my family, and the malign whispers that haunted me were all merging into a cacophony of anguish. The cold night air was biting, the temperature dropping further as I walked. My exhaustion was overwhelming, and I could feel the last vestiges of my resolve starting to crumble. I had been on the move for hours, my energy depleted, and my mind was fraying at the edges. I knew I couldn't continue like this forever. Something had to change, or I would be consumed by the very darkness that surrounded me. I found myself standing in front of a small, abandoned church. The building was partially ruined, but it seemed to offer some semblance of refuge. The doors creaked as I pushed them open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The church, with its broken pews and scattered debris, felt strangely calm compared to the chaos outside. It was as if this place held a brief respite from the nightmare. Inside, the cold was less biting, and I sat on a dusty pew trying to catch my breath. The shadows cast by the remnants of stained glass windows seemed to form grotesque shapes on the walls. The silence was almost comforting in its familiarity, but the sense of being watched never fully left me. It was as if the very building was aware of my presence and was holding its breath in anticipation. As I rested, the whispers continued to haunt me, their voices growing more desperate and insistent. They seemed to be urging me toward a choice, a decision that I could not fully comprehend. The echoes of my family's voices mingled with the whispers, their pleas for release growing more urgent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something terrible was about to happen. In the dim light of the church, I made a decision. I could not remain in this place, nor could I continue wandering aimlessly. I had to find a way to survive, to move forward, despite the overwhelming despair. But the weight of the choice was not so simple. To leave the church meant venturing back into the darkness of the city, where the horrors I had faced would only be amplified. The church offered a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I could momentarily escape the relentless torment of the outside world. But staying here would mean succumbing to a different kind of despair. The despair of inaction, of giving up hope. I needed to decide whether to continue searching for survivors, to uncover whatever remains of humanity, or to surrender to the madness that threatened to engulf me. With a heavy heart, I rose from the pew and made my way to the door. The church was a temporary refuge, but I could not stay here forever. The city outside held both hope and terror, and my survival depended on my ability to navigate that uncertain terrain. I had to press on, to face the unknown, and to confront the nightmares that awaited me. As I stepped out of the church, the darkness of the city enveloped me once more. The whispers grew louder, a haunting reminder of the choice I had made. I knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with danger, but it was a path I had to take. The horrors I had already faced were only a glimpse of what lay ahead, and I was determined to confront them, no matter the cost. The city stretched out before me, a vast empty wasteland filled with shadows and echoes. Each step I took was a step into the unknown, a journey into the heart of darkness. The choice had been made, and there was no turning back. The path to survival would be long and treacherous, but I was resolved to face it, to seek out any sign of life, and to find a way to endure in this new, shattered world. The whispers continued to haunt me, a constant reminder of the ghosts of the past and the trials that lay ahead. I pressed forward into the darkness, knowing that the true horror was not just the devastation around me, but the darkness within, the creeping madness that threatened to consume me. The journey was just beginning, and the city held its secrets close, ready to reveal them one step at a time.